everybody, and welcome back to Career Conversations. I'm Izal.
I'm Dakota.
I'm Laura.
And we are here to continue our pre-interview mini-series. If you haven't already, feel free to check out our last video. It was all about how to research. How to do research for an interview. So the topic that we're going to be diving into for this conversation are the different types of interview questions. So the types that we're going to be covering today are traditional interview questions, behavioral interview questions, situational, and informational/technical. So definitely a lot to cover in this video. So we'll go ahead and get started and dive into our first, which are traditional interview questions. So examples of traditional interview questions are, where do you see yourself in 5, 10 years? Strengths, weaknesses. Those are all examples of what we call traditional interview questions. The first one that I really want to dive into, though, because I feel like people struggle with this one, is that tell me about yourself question. I feel like they're like, well, where do I go with this? And I hear it all. I hear people telling me their life story and how many dogs and cats that they have. And then I have other people that are telling me all about like their profession and experience and things of that nature. So if we're giving our audience some feedback, what type of feedback should we share with them?
We need to tell them our education. We basically need to tell them how our education and our work experience, or how that ties into the actual job. Mm-hmm. So we need to say, because even though they have our resume, they've seen our resume, and obviously they've stayed, they know that we're qualified for the position, so that's why we have the interview. But we need to let them know, like, how does our education and how does our work experience, tie to the job posting. So you would have to state, what is the highest level of education? Even if you're not done with your degree, you need to tell them that you're, pursuing your degree and when you're going to be done and what that degree name is, and, where you're getting that degree from. And then you need to state what your skills are and your qualifications and through work experience. So that could mean something like, well, I have 3 years of working in retail, and I've been doing cashiering for the past 2 years, and within that you're kind of going to expand, but it really depends on the job description. So that's why in our previous video we kind of talked about making sure that you have that job description, so that way you can talk about this particular question, because it is a really important question. It's the first question you're going to be asked, and it's kind of like the almost like the 60-second or 30-second commercial, or your introductory about yourself. So it's kind of like summing all of that together of like your education and your work experience. So you want to make sure that you know yourself. Mm-hmm. So that job description is crucial when you're tying in that first question of answering that.
My tip is, if it doesn't go on your resume, you probably shouldn't talk about it in the tell me about yourself. Mm-hmm. So if you wouldn't put on your resume that you have 3 dogs, you probably don't want to talk about it during this question, because it just isn't relevant to the situation. Because, we get nervous, and it's sometimes easier to talk about those things in our personal life just because it's something you live through every day. But if you didn't put it on your resume, you don't really want to talk about it in this question, because it's supposed to be professional. These employers want to hear a summary of your resume.
Exactly.
Yeah, that's a good point, because your resume is supposed to be tailored to that job posting.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So you're kind of saying that elevator speech, think of this as like you're essentially setting the stage for yourself, right? This is a first question you're going to be asked, and it's not like, it's kind of a fine balance. I see some people that get through this question in like 30 seconds or maybe just like 60 seconds. But it's a fine balance. You want to be thorough and be concise with your responses. You don't want to go it through quick. You don't want to get through it so quickly where you're cutting yourself short. But you don't want to spend, 10 minutes on it. You don't want to go dive deep. So think of this from that high level perspective. How can I summarize my education, my experiences, my skill sets, all the things that relate to the job? Right. How can I summarize that into this statement here? So again, it's, letting them know your educational background, what you received your degree in, what you've learned through your education and the types of courses you've taken. If you've worked, summarizing your work experiences, the type of skill sets that you developed and how those relate to those positions. Those are really the things that you should be covering in that first question. And some employers may want to know a little bit about you, but don't lead with that. Let them open that door up. So you always lead professionally. So always think about your skill sets and your experiences. Never lead personally in interview questions unless the employer kind of opens the door. So in this question, we love that you have, children or dogs and love to hike or do those things, but that's not necessarily what we want to hear unless they ask you for it. So again, always lead professionally is definitely our advice. And this could be asked different ways. The tell me about yourself. They may just simply ask, tell me about yourself. Or they may ask it in a way like, please describe how your education experience relates, which is kind of like a better way. But no matter what, how it's posed, it's kind of all wanting the same type of information. So
yeah, and I think that you should have this answer written down before your interview, because I feel that if you talk too much about yourself, you might be answering another question, and it's really awkward when they ask you another question and you've already answered it in the tell me about yourself, and then you're like, oh no, now I'm going to have to either repeat myself, which is not what you want to do, or you're scrambling and in your brain trying to think of another answer.
Yeah, I think that, and that's why I think that high level is so important. Yeah, so don't go too dive into all the things, because you're right, you might be asked about something differently. It's again, how can I summarize it? How can I put it in a high level way? So if I need to go into details and specific, I still have the opportunity to do that throughout my other questions that I have. Right. So yeah, great example on the tell me about yourself. Another one that people kind of struggle with that I want to go over quickly is the strengths and weaknesses one. A lot of people are like, oh, I don't know what to say, or I'm struggling with it. I think oftentimes employers ask this question because they want to know that people are self-aware, right? Like we're aware of our strengths, we're aware of our areas of opportunity. And so I think it's just really wise for us when we're giving examples, or when we are answering this question, is to give concrete examples. Because oftentimes I hear people say like, oh my gosh, I am a really great collaborator, I have really great teamwork skills, and I have strong communication skills. And then for me, I feel like anytime you could provide concrete examples for the things that you're saying, you're providing evidence to the employer, which will make you more believable, and that level of trust will be there. So don't just ramble off and say, I'm good at these things. Like, follow it up with a very quick example of how you've actually executed that successfully. And I'm not saying like spend 5 minutes on each example. I'm talking about like, give me one quick example for each thing that you list. So again, I have that level of evidence. That's kind of my feedback when I have people answer strengths questions. And then the weakness one, I don't know if anybody wants to jump in on the weakness or have anything to add to that.
Yeah, other than the weakness is really about where can you improve. And I have I have a tip. So, look at the job description and look at the skills that are listed there. Don't say any of those are your weaknesses, because if communication is like the number one skills that's listed in the job description, you don't want to say, well, my weakness is communication, because then that kind of, already sets a bad tone. So I would kind of look at the job description, and maybe kind of identify like what your weakness could be. And your weakness doesn't have to be like a particular like organization. It could be something like, well, I'm not really experienced with doing data entry or like, budgeting. I mean, you could be honest about that, because those are things that you can learn. So don't think of something that's like, oh, I'm not a good collaborator. Maybe it's just something that you're not good in a function, and something that, you don't have a lot of experience.
Yeah, and I'd always follow up the weakness with how you're working to improve it. Right. Never just leave it at, this is my weakness. Like, always be like, if you happen to double check your work a lot and you're a big perfectionist, well, how are you working to build your confidence in yourself? And, things like that. Just make sure that you're giving concrete examples of how you're trying to follow up with those weaknesses and make them better.
Yeah, very good. Okay, so the next one we can kind of jump into are behavioral type questions. So I find that behavioral type questions tend to be a bulk of what kind of interview questions are all about. And so behavioral questions are things like, give me an example of a time where you worked with a difficult customer, or have you ever. So anytime you hear something like that, like have you ever, give me an example, that's kind of like ding ding ding, this is a behavioral type interview question. And these are very popular because oftentimes employers believe that how you performed in the past is going to be a good predictor of how you perform in the future. So they want to actually see concrete examples. So when being asked a behavioral type question, hopefully you've done that job description analysis and you have concrete examples on the top of your mind. But when you're thinking of those concrete examples, I like to kind of focus on the STAR method, or some people call it the SAR method. Is there a method that you guys like to follow?
STAR,
right? Yeah. So for those, and jump in at any time. So when looking at the STAR method, point one, I kind of combine like the S and the T. So the first thing that you want to do is talk about the either situation or the task that was at hand. So if you're being asked, give me a time that you worked with a difficult customer, you would say something like, at my previous position when I worked as a customer service representative at X, Y, and Z company, there was this one instance where I was speaking with a customer over the phone and blah, 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 blah. So tell me what was going on and tell me what was happening. And then after you go over the S and the T, it's you want to then lead into actions. So actions is kind of like, okay, well, what did you do? Like, I always say, like, it's almost like a play-by-play. I don't know if you have a better way to describe it. But to me, I'm kind of like, tell me what you did. Like, what was your play-by-play? Like, what did you do? So that's kind of what I like to hear in the action. And then what's super important, I don't know if you guys experience this when you're working with students, is oftentimes I feel that people forget the last piece, but it's so important that you always have the third piece of this, which is the R, which stands for like results. It's kind of like when you're reading a book or you're watching a movie, like no one really likes cliffhangers, right? Like you don't want to be left in a cliffhanger. And I feel like if you're not giving us a result, like what was the outcome, what was accomplished, how did that situation end? If you're not giving us that piece of information, we're like on a cliffhanger. Like I want to know, how did it end? Like was a person happy? Were they upset? Were things getting resolved? So for me, it's really important that when answering a behavioral type question, they're following that STAR method, right? So situation, action, or situation, task, what was the action, and then what was the result or the resolution. And hopefully if you follow that, go ahead.
Yeah, sometimes I refer it to like as a movie. So like when you're watching a movie, there's always like something that happens and then, the middle part, and then at the end, the good outcome. So like, regardless, however you're answering the question, you want to make sure that it's something that you've handled yourself without having to call a supervisor. And then you want to say how things worked out well. So pick a situation that, you handled everything great to the best of your ability. And then the outcome was good. Because you don't want to say that, the outcome was terrible, because then it kind of like, you didn't really handle that situation well.
Yeah, so always a beginning, middle, and an end.
Right, right. And then also, too, you might get a behavioral question that might be several parts. So, like, one of the questions could be, tell me about when you had to manage multiple projects. How did you manage and what was the outcome? So, again, there's like the three part. So you want to make sure that you're answering every single one of those parts of that question.
Yeah, so good. I used to do like this thing on my fingers, and it's so weird, but like when people would ask me questions, I would kind of like, okay, this is question 1, question 2, question 3. And so as I was questioning, I would kind of hold it and I'm like, oh my gosh, I'm missing something. Like, what did I miss? Right. And I'll ask them to repeat it or to kind of say it again. So that was super helpful for me. But yeah, the STAR method, go on YouTube. Like I'm like a visual learner. I like to hear things and see things before I kind of feel comfortable with it. Hop on YouTube, Google like STAR method interview or things like that, so you could see actual examples. Because I feel like once you start hearing it, you're going to be like, that's what they mean by it. Some people I find follow it naturally. Other people have pieces of it, but not quite all of it, or some people kind of just skim through it so quickly. So definitely listen, go online, look for examples, listen to it. And then if this is really a new concept for you, then, start off by practicing. So the situation was, the actions that I took were, and the results was. So you can kind of put those placeholders as you practice, but the goal really is, the more you do it, you just start taking that verbiage out, because that habit is already there, and you will no longer need it, because you'll naturally follow into the situation, action, result. So you could always start again, if it's a new concept, with putting those placeholders. The situation was, or my task was, the actions that I took were, and the result. But we really want to get you to a place where you no longer need to use those placeholders for you anymore.
Right.
So
and
that's
another
really
thing that I
important.
want to mention is that if you are talking about somebody else, so if it's like, tell me about a time we had to deal with a difficult customer, you don't really want to talk about that person. It's more about the situation. So you don't have to say, well, I was dealing with this really mean person, and you don't really have to talk about what the person looked like, how they acted, other than that they were not happy. You don't need to go in those details, because those aren't important. What's important is, like, how did you handle the situation? So just talk about that, and leave all the other details of the other person that you're dealing with, because that is really not part of what they want to hear.
Yeah, word choice is so important.
Yeah.
Yeah. Unsatisfied customer is probably the best term to use.
Yeah.
Just let them know they weren't happy with what was happening. It has nothing to do with them. They just weren't happy about it.
Yeah.
You know what I also find, quickly just to add to it before we move on, is what some people do that I just love is, after the resolution, they talk about what they've learned from the experience.
Right.
So I love it when people kind of are able to add that to the end, because there's that piece of self-reflection, which I think is so nice to hear, like, as an employer on the other side of the table. So just know, for behavioral type questions, one, you need to have concrete examples. We don't want to hear, oh, sure, I deal with difficult people all the time. I normally, try to talk calmly with them, bring them down. If it's something that I can, assist with, then I will. But if it's something out of my scope, I'll try to bring in a manager. You're not answering the question. You're giving me this, like, oversight. This is what I do. What we want to hear is an example of this is, and then go into your concrete example. So that's really key. You need to have an actual concrete example, and you want to follow the STAR method to be able to make sure that you're answering it effectively. Okay, I'm going to move on to the next one. So we're going to quickly talk about situational. So situational are like, if you saw someone stealing, what would you do? Like, it's those, it's really hard to prepare for situational questions, but these are where employers might give you a scenario and see how you're going to react to it. So it's really, again, these are sometimes hard to prepare, but if you have something similar that's happened, you could always bring that in as an example, like, oh, in fact, I've had a similar experience, and kind of go into that STAR, let me know about it. But I always want to say that you never want to lie in an interview. So you don't want to, like, make a story up for the sake of having something and be able to respond. So if you've honestly have never been in a situation before, you could just maybe answer with how you believe you would react, or how you believe you would behave to something if you were in that situation. So again, this is kind of just, it's that moral compass. This is sometimes why they ask these types of questions. So we want you to be aware that those questions are out there and it's available. And if you have previous experiences that you can draw and pull from to help you answer that question, then do that. But if not, then let us hear how you believe you would react in that type of situation. And then lastly, we just want to, anything to add to that? Yeah, those are kind of like, I haven't personally, has anybody experienced a situational? I'm trying to think if I've ever actually had a situational question.
I haven't personally, but I know, like, when you're getting interviewed to be a police officer, those are, like, super important ones, and you should never go straight to your supervisor if you're having an issue with a coworker. That's, like, my one tidbit. Like, that's probably not your best answer for that question. Always say you'd work with them first, and if things don't go as well, you can start escalating the situation. So that's my tidbit.
Yeah, there's probably more industries. I was going to say maybe like healthcare might be another one where that situational, like if this happened to a patient, what would you do kind of thing. So there might be industries where it's more common. I just haven't had the pleasure of experiencing a situational one before. But the other one that we kind of want to talk about is the like technical informational type of interview questions, because those are also kind of common and you might be asked. Right. Does anybody want to dive into that quickly?
Sure. So the technical one could be like, it depends on the job description. So maybe you're interviewing for a position where you have to do like a lot of data entry. So maybe the question is something like, tell me about your data entry experience. And so that's when you're going to talk about, the type of program that you've done data entry. You're going to talk about the type of information that you're doing data entry. You're going to talk about maybe if you have to do any reporting. You're going to talk about, kind of like the details. You don't want to just say, yes, I've done data entry in Excel. You kind of want to talk more about, okay, what was the information? How often do you do it? Kind of just give them a scope of that experience. And then if you want to follow up with an example, that'd be great, because you can say, for instance, I work in Excel, I would say 3 hours a day, and I'm doing data entry, and whatever it is. But kind of just explaining what you're doing, because you really want to let them know how often you use it. If you don't have any experience in Excel, or, you talk about the other programs. But, I know that some job postings might be like an actual entry level where they want you to do data entry. So if you've taken a class, you can talk about, what you've learned in your class, if you've taken an Excel class or another program for accounting. So you can talk about that experience, and that will sometimes help, because I know you're doing in those classes some projects where you're actually doing data entry and stuff for programming. So you can talk about that.
Yeah, for sure. I'm always, and it's kind of annoying, you're going to hear me saying it all the time, but I'm like, anytime you can give a concrete example to provide evidence, do it. You're going to be believable. And I feel like when you give examples of things, it's kind of like storytelling. A lot of times we remember people through stories. And so if you're not giving us concrete examples through your responses, and people are interviewing, if I'm somebody that's interviewing 8 people or 7 or 6 people in one day, I'm going to remember the person that gave those concrete examples, like, oh yes, Izelle, that's the one that blah, 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 blah. Because I'm going to remember through the storytelling that you're giving us through these answers. So again, anytime you can give those concrete examples, you can do that. So if it's that data piece, you could say, I am very comfortable. I use Excel almost daily. In fact, more recently, I've worked on this large project where I had to do blah, blah, blah. I was collecting. This is what I was doing with the data. This is how I manipulated it. Or if not, you could say something how through a course that I'm taking or through a course that I took, we had to do this large project, and this is what we did, and this is what we did with the information. So again, try to give those concrete examples whenever you can. And hopefully by doing that job description analysis, you've already thought about experiences or examples. It's now just about fleshing it out. And thinking about those examples through that STAR method lens, so that way that you're effectively or more effectively answering those interview questions. So I think we'll end it with that. We hope that you found this video helpful, kind of giving you that introductory to the different types of interview questions and how you might go about in approaching it. If you need any help with that, know that you could always visit us in Career Services. Give us a call, shoot us an email, schedule an appointment, and we'd love to help you. So we'll end there. We hope to see you guys next time. Bye.
Bye.